Before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe. Imagine a time without zippers, buttons, or stretchy fabric. In the Middle Ages, clothes were made by hand and told a story about who you were. From the simple clothes of a farmer to the fancy robes of a king, every piece of clothing had a purpose and a place in the world. Let's explore the different kinds of clothes people wore in this exciting time. Tunic, a long shirt worn over the body, usually knee or ankle length. The tunic was the most fundamental garment for all social classes. It was typically constructed from a large rectangular piece of fabric folded in half, with a hole cut for the head. The sleeves were often simple rectangles sewn to the sides for a better fit, especially in the 12th century. A seam would be placed down the sides, and sometimes gauze triangular pieces of fabric were added at the hem to allow for more movement and a flared silhouette. Peasants wore tunics made from rough, scratchy wool or linen. Their tunics were usually a simple, natural color like brown, gray, or white, because those colors were easy to make. They needed their tunics to be strong and durable to last through a long day of work in the fields. Noblemen had tunics that were much more luxurious. They were made of soft silk, shiny velvet, or fine wool, and they were dyed in bright, beautiful colors like deep red, royal blue, or gold. Their tunics often had a fancy belt or a special embroidery to show how important they were. Children also wore tunics, which were perfect for playing and running around. These were often simple hand-me-downs from adults and might have patches on them where they were mended again and again. Hose, tight-fitting cloth leggings worn on the legs, sometimes footed. These were basically very long socks that went all the way up to the waist. Hose were not a single garment but were instead two separate pieces, one for each leg, which were attached by points laces to the bries. A loose-fitting linen undergarment. In the later Middle Ages, a piece of fabric called a codpiece was sometimes added to cover the crotch area, becoming a symbol of masculinity and fashion. Men of all classes wore hose. They were an important part of a man's outfit, worn under tunics or with a short jacket. Noblemen wore brightly colored hose that often matched their tunics. They might be half one color and half another to show their family's colors. Peasants wore simple hose made from rough wool. They were tough and warm, perfect for keeping their legs covered while they worked in the cold or rain. Gown or kirtle, a long fitted dress worn by women. This was a woman's main piece of clothing. In the early Middle Ages, gowns were loose and flowing, but as fashion changed, they became much more fitted. In the 12th century, the blouse became popular. It was a closely fitted gown that laced up the sides and had sleeves that were tight from the shoulder to the elbow, and then flared out dramatically to the wrist. The kirtle was the primary dress for women of all classes, serving as both an outer garment and a layer beneath a more elaborate gown. Noble women wore stunning, elegant gowns. These dresses were made of expensive fabrics and could have very long sleeves or a skirt that trailed on the floor. Their gowns often had special patterns woven into the fabric and were cinched at the waist to create a beautiful shape. Peasant women wore simpler kirtles made from linen or thick, coarse wool. Their dresses were looser and more practical, allowing them to move around easily for their daily chores. Educated women or nuns might wear modest layered gowns. They were often a single dark color and were designed to be simple and humble. Surcoat, a sleeveless or short-sleeved outer garment worn over other clothes. Think of it like a vest or a long overshirt. The surcoat was a versatile garment. Early surcoats, called cyclists, were simple, straight pieces of fabric worn over a tunic. Later, the jupon became popular for knights. A close-fitting padded garment worn over chainmail, often decorated with the wearer's heraldry. Knights wore surcoats over their armor. These surcoats were a very clever idea. They would display the knight's coat of arms, which was a special symbol for his family. This helped everyone on the battlefield tell who was who. Nobles wore richly decorated surcoats at court or public events. These were often made of velvet and trimmed with fancy fur. Women also wore surcoats over their dresses. Sometimes they had open sides to show off the beautiful gown underneath. Cloak or mantle. a loose outer covering like a cape worn for warmth and status. This was the medieval version of a winter coat or a raincoat. A mantle was typically fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin. The fabric length and clasp were all indicators of wealth. For instance, the use of expensive dyes like Tyrian purple and Kermes red was reserved for the highest nobility and royalty. Royalty and nobles wore long, luxurious cloaks. They were often lined with expensive fur, like ermine or squirrel, to keep them warm. The lengthened fabric of the cloak showed just how important a person was. Clergy and monks wore plain, simple mantles as part of their religious dress. They were often a dark color like black or brown. Peasants used rough wool cloaks to stay warm during the cold winter months and to protect themselves from the rain. Their cloaks were simple but very useful. Head coverings, various hats, veils, and hoods worn by both men and women. Head coverings were very important back then. For men, a simple linen coif was common, often worn under a helmet for comfort and to absorb sweat. For women, head coverings were a sign of their marital status and modesty. A wimple was a piece of cloth that covered the neck and chin, often worn with a veil over the hair. The most extravagant headdresses, like the hinin, a tall cone with a veil, were worn in the late Middle Ages and were often supported by a wire frame. Women wore veils, wimples, or linen caps to cover their hair. This was a sign of modesty and a way to protect their hair from dust. Men wore hoods, felt hats, or simple linen caps called coifs, which were tied under the chin. Noble women wore the most elaborate headdresses. The most famous was the hennin, a very tall cone-shaped hat with a long thin veil that floated down the back. It looked like something a fairy princess would wear. Shoes made of soft leather, mostly flat. The style of a person's shoe could tell you a lot about their life. Medieval shoes were typically made using turnshoe construction, where the leather was sewn inside out and then turned right side out to hide the seams. The most famous shoes were the poulines, or krakos, which had incredibly long pointed toes. The length of the toe was often regulated by sumptuary laws, as it was a clear sign of wealth and social status. Peasants wore basic, durable leather shoes. They had to be strong enough for long days of walking and working in the fields. Sometimes, if they couldn't afford shoes, they would even go barefoot. Nobles had very special shoes. The longer the toe, the more important you were. They were too long and pointy for walking in, so rich people would often have to tie the tips of their shoes to their knees to walk around. Knights wore tough leather boots, which were often reinforced under their armor to protect their feet. Accessories, items worn on or with clothing to carry tools or show wealth. Belts were one of the most important accessories. Men's belts held purses, daggers, and other useful items. Women wore a girdle, which was a belt that was often very decorative and was a key part of their outfit. Purses or almoners were small drawstring bags attached to the belt, which were used to carry coins, keys, or other small belongings. Workers wore simple leather belts with small pouches attached. They would use these to carry coins, tools, or anything else they needed for their work. Nobles wore many decorative accessories. These included fancy belts made of silver or gold, rings, beautiful brooches to pin their cloaks, and elegant chains around their necks. Travelers and pilgrims carried leather bags, small flasks for water, and a sturdy walking stick to help them on their long journeys. Armor, special protective clothing made of metal, worn in battle. Knights were like superheroes in their armor, but it was incredibly heavy. Early medieval armor was primarily chainmail or mail, made of thousands of interlocking metal rings to protect against cuts. By the late Middle Ages, plate armor became more common. This was made of solid, articulated metal plates that offered better protection against crushing blows. Knights wore many layers of armor. The first layer was a padded jacket called a gambeson. This was followed by shiny chainmail made of thousands of tiny metal rings. On top of that, they would wear large metal plates called plate armor on their chests, arms, and legs. Soldiers who were not knights might wear simpler armor. Some wore only a chainmail shirt or a helmet. Royal guards had fancy, highly decorated ceremonial armor for special events and parades. Robes, long flowing garments worn for formality, religion, or learning. Robes were a sign of a person's profession and status. For example, the habits of religious orders were simple: rough-spun wool robes, with different colors and styles for each order, like the black of the Benedictines or the white of the Cistercians. In academic settings, robes were worn to signify a person's status as a scholar or a student, a tradition that continues today. Monks and nuns wore simple robes made of rough cloth. These robes were a sign of their faith and were often tied with a simple rope belt. Scholars and priests wore dark robes that showed they were wise and educated. They often had hoods attached to the robes. Royalty wore the most luxurious robes for special occasions. These were made of fine silk or velvet and were often trimmed with soft, beautiful fur and gold threads. Undergarments, worn under clothing for comfort and hygiene. These were the very first layer of clothing that everyone wore, no matter who they were. Men's undergarments were called brais, a loose-fitting linen breech tied at the waist. Women wore a chemise or smock, a simple linen shift that was lightweight and easy to wash. As outer garments were rarely cleaned, these undergarments absorbed sweat and dirt, keeping the expensive outer clothes from getting soiled. All classes wore a simple linen shift or chemise, so it's like a big loose-fitting undershirt that went all the way down to the knees. This kept the outer clothes clean and was comfortable against the skin. Knights wore a very thick, padded underclothing under their armor. This was very important to prevent the metal from rubbing and scratching their skin. Women always wore a simple base layer before putting on their gowns or dresses.